The American poet Walt Whitman wrote, "In the faces of men and women, I see God." In the year 1907, a face appeared in history that would change the landscape of the Anglican Communion and mirror the face of God. That face belonged to the Reverend Dr. Florence Lee Timoy. She was a modest, humble servant of God who had known social and political upheaval, lived through 2 world wars and a shattering revolution in her homeland, China. She had known loneliness, suffering, and persecution, and was the subject of one of the most controversial moments in modern church history when she became the first woman to be ordained a priest in the Anglican Church. And that was in 1944. But it is not the legend nor her fame that those who knew her best remember. Their memories reflect the images of a unique and selfless child of God whose deep spiritual strength was shared with those who loved and worked with her. For more than 11 years after her official retirement from China, Florence Lee Timoy continued to work for the church she loved. This is the story about those remarkable years following her return from Hepu and about the people who loved her.
Will you remember?
I will always remember her as a wonderful sister, very forgiving towards us, because when we were little we were naughty. And then I remember her especially for her devotion to the church and to the people whom she had the opportunity to serve. It took me 7 years to write to the Chinese authorities in China to argue for her case. And finally, she got permission to come out. So I said to Timoy, welcome back to this free world to join your family. And then the next thing I would hope that you would do would be to sit down quietly to write your memoirs. Join many, many programs of the church. Sometimes I wasn't so happy because she was getting older and older, and I thought she could cut down a little bit of her activities, but she never agreed with me on that particular point. She said, here's the church needs people to participate in the activities. If you don't go, I don't go, who will go? Nobody will go. That won't do. We must keep the church going, and the church must be active and must try to preach and spread the gospel and to make friends for Jesus Christ. Making friends for Jesus Christ is a saying that Timoy loved to say. She's a very modest person, especially when the General Theological Seminary wrote to say that they would award her this honorary degree of divinity. Timoy told me, I mean, I'm the sister. It's really genuine expression from her. Oh, you know, Rita, I have done so little. All the things I have done are not important at all, and now they are giving me such a great honor. I really feel that I should not receive it, should not accept it. I don't deserve it. I said, oh, don't talk like that. If people honor you that way, you should receive it. And of course, last year, the second time, when a theological college awarded her such a high honor, she was very sick in the hospital, and she was not able to go to the Toronto Trinity College to receive this honor. So I was her proxy. I went on the 14th of May to the Trinity College to receive that honor on behalf of my sister.
Now, when I came in 1984, I was very impressed by her presence, and immediately I requested the advisory board and the wardens that I will need her assistance. So we asked her to be the honorary assistant of St. Matthew, St. John's. and she actually took part in both the English service as well as the Chinese service. Now, whenever we have Holy Communion, then she will always be there to help celebrate or to give the elements to the people. Then she participated very actively in all the adult groups that we have, the women's group, the adult fellowship, the prayer groups we have, and we sort of alternate. She took part in a lot of the Bible study groups, and especially the evangelistic meetings. And I remember very clearly that one day it was snowing very heavily. She, at that time, was already 81, insisted on joining the door-to-door evangelism team, knocking on doors and meeting people, saying hello, giving them some gospel tracts and invite people to come to church. And it was a very snowy afternoon and very, very cold. Now, she's that kind of a lady. And also, whenever she can, she would come to the service early and well prepared, and she loved to preach, and also she celebrated the communion all the way until she was 82. And now I remember clearly that at 82 she said, I really need to retire. But after retirement again, whenever we need her, if I need a special pair of hands, at the altar, she will come. But even after her declared retirement, she continued to be chaplain to our St. Luke's fellowship. Oh yes, in many of our Christmas parties, when we were singing and dancing, she insisted on dancing. At that time she was about 79 or 80. And also when in one of the wedding parties, when the bride was taking out the garter and throwing out, she was leading the whole pack of unmarried ladies trying to get that, and that was a hilarious time. We just all laughed, and she said, well, I'm still available, And she's that kind of a humorous, very human, and very down-to-earth person. I think I was about 4 or 5 years old, and she was just ordained deacon at the cathedral in Hong Kong, and she was sent to be the assistant curate at All Saints Parish, which was my home parish. And my father was very happy to meet her, and so invited her to come to our house when we have a big Thanksgiving service in the house. And I remember very clearly when she was preaching, somehow I asked my sister to give me a long ribbon, and I put it on, and I stood right by her, and she let me stood right by her all the time, all this time during the homily. And that was my first relationship with her. The night before she died, she was also calling several people by telephone and doing ministry, counseling, encouragement, saying prayers over the telephone. She's that dedicated, that her life is a life of prayer, a life of ministry. So I think working with her is a real blessing. There was no difficult feelings, and everything was so, she's so supportive, and she's very sensitive. She knows if I'm unhappy or frustrated, she will give me all the backup, and all the encouragement. And she's always on a very positive note. That's the wonderful part of her, I think.
I met Lê Timoy was soon after I arrived in Hong Kong as a missionary in 1949. For the first time, I saw a woman robed in the sanctuary, and this made a very deep impression upon me. I think I would say she was a woman of great integrity, a woman who knew that God had called her and she was fulfilling his work, and nothing was going to destroy this. I think of quiet friendship. She was a tremendous one for friendship, and she believed that she was working to help other people become friends of Jesus. These were words that Bishop R.O. Hall had said to her many, many years before. And I think that she did value our friendship. Friendship that she found was all over the world. In Westminster Abbey, we were celebrating her 40th anniversary as a priest. She was staying with me in the country, and the Bishop of Buckingham on that morning of the 25th of January celebrated in her honour, and it was beautiful. But the actual celebrations took place in Westminster Abbey, and it was a tremendous occasion. The Abbey was packed, and all our friends and relatives were gathered around. It was wonderful.
Remember that my father was in China and I was back in this country, and so I saw very little of him until he came home for the Lambeth Conference in 1948. And so Liti Moy was just a name to me, although she'd met me when I was knee-high to a grasshopper when I was small out in Hong Kong. But I know that my father was very much on the carpet at the Lambeth Conference, and we disappeared up to the Lake District in the north of England to get away from the press when the report came out, but we were run to earth, and I know my father had an interview given there. And so he was very much under pressure at that time, and as you know, she then came under pressure to resign her license, although she never resigned her own priesthood. But later I heard that Bishop Michael Ramsey, who became the Archbishop of Canterbury later on, he was told to expect some fiend to turn up at the Lambeth Conference. The Church Times had described him as a wild man from the woods, and Michael Ramsey told my father's biography that when they met him, they met a very godly man, a very godly man. Liti Moy met me when I was small, but I didn't then meet her again until the marvellous celebration of the 40th anniversary of her ordination in Westminster Abbey in January 1984. And as Providence would have it, we met during the peace at that great Eucharistic service in the Abbey. And then the following weekend she came to stay with me and to preach for me in Bolton. And that was the first time that I really got to know her as a person, and I heard her story from her own lips. And the thing that came through to me was that she wasn't just the woman who happened to be in a certain place at a certain time that was the right time and the right place. She had been prepared for that by God, and she didn't bring it upon herself. She was chosen to do that work, and she simply regarded herself as an instrument, a small instrument in the hands of God to do his purpose. And that was the beginning of the priesthood of women for the Church of God. She preached, Liti Moy preached, as I said, at Bolton for me, but I remember full well the text on which she preached, which was, having loved his own, he loved them unto the end. And that seemed to encapsulate her life and the way in which she survived all that the Red Guards and what I call the Purple Guards threw at her. And then after the service, this diminutive woman stood in the porch, and to the great surprise of that rather stuffy congregation, was sort of reaching up and giving them a hug and giving them a kiss. And they took it from her because that was the nature of the person. I'm sure Liti Moy will be regarded as significant, but I think we have to recognize that the ministry may well then take on a quite separate shape. There's a sense in which Christianity has taken on a shape rather different from its founder, and so I think one cannot assume that the founder, as it were, the pioneer, will necessarily shape the ministry for the future. But I'm sure that she will be very much a role model for the future, and one that I hope will be encapsulated by history, and people will look up to her and follow her, although she would never expect to be looked up to by anybody. I was delighted to be there on that night during the Lambeth Conference in 1988 when the film of her life was shown, because that seemed to me to be her justification, and so there she was, being fated, as it were, given her rightful place in the context where 40 years before she had been rubbished as being something that should never have been. And it seemed to me that the words of the Magnificat had come true, that God would put down the mighty from their seats and exalt the humble and meek. And that seemed to encapsulate the situation that took place that night.
I knew about Florence Lee Timoy before I met her, knew much about her ministry. She was, of course, a celebrated figure to many of us, but I met her personally for the first time at the opening of the 1988 Lambeth Conference. We were photographed together outside Canterbury Cathedral by one of the London newspapers, and there appeared a rather unfavorable story about us in the press, but we shared that moment together, being photographed outside the cathedral. We then went back to the hotel where she was staying and had tea and a wonderful, wonderful conversation. And it may sound trite to say, but we bonded immediately. One of her contributions certainly was a shining example of how to courageously do ministry under adverse conditions, perhaps conditions which many of us will never know. I think another of her great gifts was her example of humility, in that she was willing to put aside the title and the trappings of the office of priest to avoid the great controversy that centered around her ordination, and to be willing to lay that aside for a while, knowing full well that she was a priest in God's eyes, and that her to function openly as a priest was a great gift. If I had to use a single word, I would say grace-filled. She had an air of humility that really belied her great strength. Strength of character, strength of will, strength of faith. And that came through to me shining clear in a conversation that I had with her in her apartment shortly before her death in Toronto. I was privileged to have tea with her again, and just her deep and abiding faith, her great humility, but her great strength just shone through in her conversation. She was indeed a gracious lady. She was a concelebrant at my consecration in 1989, and it was no accident. With the help of the presiding bishop, Bishop Browning, we were very anxious to have her present, and her presence was not only an inspiration to me, it was an inspiration to the many, many women clergy who were present that day and vested and participated in the service. Well, in the excitement of the service, I don't recall anything specific that she said, but I do recall her very warm embrace as she was announced and came forward to the podium to greet me. And she greeted many, many others, but I will treasure her warm embrace that day.
The first time I met her, I was amazed at how tiny she was, and also the strength and the steadiness of her vision. She looked right at you, and there was a warmth in that vision. You had a sense of a person that was small, but very powerful and very strong. Tim Hoi Lee has always been spoken of by women. I don't think she realized how much that event in Hong Kong had been written about and thought about by women in other parts of the world. And then when it became known that she had resigned the exercise because of her love for the church and didn't make a strident issue about it at that time, but still believed and was convinced that she was a priest. And then when the opportunity came to exercise that ministry, she just moved to do it with such graciousness and such commitment of faith and such love for people that she was just an outstanding example. Be a whole series of words, I think. One would be gracious, another one would be quiet strength, another one would be firmness, but yet the capacity to listen. Another one would be the twinkle of humor. There was always a twinkle in her eyes when she would talk to people, even when she was talking at intense depths and with things she was deeply concerned about. There was a friendliness that sort of bubbled out from her, and she could draw forth a response from other people very quickly.
We bought some drinks from the supermarkets, and then we went all the way to the hospital. And the first impression we got is that she's weak. It seems that when we were there, she forgot all of her own troubles. She forgot all the pains. And she just wanted to know if we are getting on well, if we are having a good time or not. Yeah. She cared about people more than herself.
One word that I would use is joyly, loyalty to God, and praise with no condemnation.
She's been homebound because of the injury for at least half a year. And for a normal person, she would be really depressed. But to my surprise, she's not depressed at all. She's very bright, and every time we visit her, she always welcomes us with a warm smile, and, despite the pain that she had been suffering.
Always her enthusiasm about life and her obedience to Christ's teaching. She often quotes the Bible, and she has very deep faith in God's grace, and this comes out constantly from her conversations with me and with other people.
Oh, when she's sick in the hospital, we go to comfort her. We went there to comfort her. You went there to serve her, but on the opposite side, she served me back.
I remember her as the cook, the favorite cook of the family, more than anything else, more than of her being a priest. She's much better cook, was a much better cook than my mom. And she's very kind, very gentle. She cherished each time, every opportunity to give a sermon in the church. And she's very serious each time. Her eyes wasn't very good, but she wouldn't let me do it for her. I said, let me do it for you. I just copy it because after you make corrections and additions and deletions, your draft become very messy now. Let me do it for you. I will do the copying. But she wouldn't let me do it. She painstakingly copy, make several drafts, copy it several times. She used to, we didn't have a lawn or anything, we just have a roof garden. And on a Sunday, she will call me up, just look at the grass, the little leaves, the dew, the morning dew on the plant. And it was her who taught me how to appreciate nature, appreciate all the creations of God, to look for the little things, really little things. Just a little dew on the grass, on the leaves.
The legacy of Dr. Timoy Lee lives on through the ministerial training of women for service in the church, made possible by the foundation which bears her name. Designed to receive contributions for the training of women all over the world, the foundation makes grants on a regular basis for their support. In her last will and testament, Dr. Lee directed that all her earthly possessions be left for the training of women to serve the church. One of the recipients of a recent foundation grant is a candidate for ordination in the Church of Uganda.
All along I felt the Lord wanted me to do something for him until I thought of going for a theological training so that I can be a full-time worker in the church. Then I shared it with my husband, and we decided that we should go and speak to the bishop. When he told me, the bishop said I should look for someone to sponsor me. Of course, I didn't have means or anybody, but after about 2 months, he called me back to his office and handed me a form from the Lithium Oil Foundation. Of course, for me, I feel I would not mind. I'm not anxious about where it will be put, because it's my conviction that the Lord wanted me to do something, and he wants me to do something for him, and I trust he knows where he will put me.
Dr. Lee's last wish was that women be empowered to take their place in the leadership of her beloved church. After so many years of service to her Lord and to the church, her innermost thoughts were expressed in 3 lovely poems which she wrote down on an old tablet as she left China for the last time in 1987.
Just like an agile little bird with wings fully stretched to fly across the boundless heaven, its eyes capture the beautiful sky adorned by fleecy, floating clouds, which make me realize how minute my size. The Creator in his great mystery has the cosmos in perfect order. With a stroke of his finger, the 3 glowing bodies fall in place. Their beams in splendor and glory shine, revealing fantastic forms and multicolors, and offering dedication and praises in joyous and harmonious phrases. Fly, fly, continue to fly to the bosom of my motherland, to imbibe the fragrance of motherly love, to feast on our forefathers' fertile land, full of flourishing growth in many respects, while reconstruction goes silently on, testifying only signs of earlier achievement.